Welcome to Plain Civics. Thank you for joining us. I'm Joe Ulery.
And I'm Bobbi Fisher.
And our goal is to break down how government works so you can make the government work for you. And we're going to jump into our episode in just a few minutes. But first, Bobbi, we're going to start with a guy who was known as the first American.
And this is our short series on Ben Franklin's virtues. This is our new continuing short series where we present the civic virtues that Benjamin Franklin, one of our most significant founders, thought to be the most important. He thought these civic virtues are qualities that help individuals become better people and contribute to a stronger society mattered just as much as public action. As we work our way through these, think about how these civic virtues track in your own life. The sixth civic virtue is industry. Franklin said, quote, "Lose no time, be always employed in something useful. Cut off all unnecessary actions." End quote. So how do you stay busy with important tasks? What do you get accomplished? What did you get accomplished?
And now our feature presentation.
Lots of issues, but there is hope. Let's get busy.
Let's get busy.
In our last episode, if you're a regular listener, we talked about getting prepared to vote since we have state primaries and November's midterm elections this year. So now that we've prepared you for how to get ready to vote, let's talk some more about some other voting issues and other issues that can affect elections, even if they're not a direct effect on them. You'll understand that more as we go on. Some of these issues we've discussed in past episodes, but they are worth repeating because they're so important. And as we've said before, hopefully if we repeat them enough, everybody will catch on.
Yes.
So first, let's start where it all begins, with education. One reason Americans often lack even basic knowledge, confidence, or conversational know-how in civics and politics is simply that they weren't taught much about how their government works in their school career. But most parents rely on schools to teach their children civics. Meanwhile, schools tend to give the subject little attention and funding because social incentives overwhelmingly favor other subjects, especially since the Cold War. The United States has prioritized STEM. STEM acronym stands for science, technology, engineering, and math. So the U.S. has prioritized STEM subjects in a bid to stay globally competitive, and this fixation on STEM has led educational standards and funding to focus more heavily on STEM subjects and language arts. Additionally, many districts evaluate teachers in schools based on test scores, resulting in curricula that prioritize test prep in math and language arts. We've seen the difference investment can make, as evidenced by annual federal level expenditures for STEM education averaging about $50 per K-12 public school student, and by contrast, funding for civic education is about 50 cents per student per year.
That number just really jumped out at me. $50 for STEM and 50 cents for civic. I mean, how did we let that happen? And I think that as a former civics teacher, that has to be so frustrating to you.
It is. And when I was still teaching and attending We the People and Project Citizen meetings and stuff, they would have annual meetings that we would go to. That's one of the things that the head organization, the Center for Civic Ed, and there's other ones out there as well, that lobby. There's an organization of state and federal legislators. They all belong to this. And even they have a lobbying branch that tries to get more investment into civics education. And for a while there, we were doing better. And then it kind of dropped off again in the last 10 years. So it amazes me, especially when I think about the purpose of our public education.
Right.
Started out as.
Right.
And seeing all these problems that we have in our nation as far as people understanding voting and elections and all that. So high school in Indiana, they get one semester.
So I would love to see us get more resources somehow put back into that.
Yeah, it does. As a former civics teacher, it makes me extremely sad. But we're not saying civics has been abandoned because most, if not all states, teach the subject at some level. But that's the problem. Few states assess discuss civics as a standalone subject. Graduation requirements throughout the United States are all over the place as far as what's required. Some states require a year of civics education, some only one semester, and some have no requirement at all. So considering that civics education was the original intent of public education back in the early 1800s when Horace Mann came up with the idea of providing a free, standardized, and universal schooling, essential for continuing the, quote, grand American experiment of self-governance, end quote, the intent was first and foremost to develop citizens who grow up with the knowledge and skills to engage in a democracy. So we've really gotten away from that quite a bit. So of eighth graders that are tested in civics, the vast majority performed at a basic or below basic level. That is, they can define some aspects of the government or constitution, but cannot discuss how citizens can interact within the political process. Only about 23% of students in any given year perform at proficiency or above. Another consequence of this nominal focus is that civics ends up being taught differently than other subjects. Math and English, for example, start with foundational concepts that build necessary skills early before layering on more complex concepts and theories. You know, you wouldn't start algebra in third grade.
Right. I couldn't, well, for me personally, I couldn't start it in 12th grade, but I get your point.
Right. Conversely, civics is often taught as a checklist of must-memorize facts that don't build into valuable skills. You know, for example, they might learn that, you know, our national government is 3 branches. Hopefully they would at least learn that's legislative, executive, and judicial, maybe checks and balances and separation of powers, but I highly doubt that most would be able to explain what those actually mean or give any examples of how they're used. The short time frame is partly to blame, but so is a social climate that makes teachers and school districts fearful that going beyond the safest of facts and trivia risks a social media firestorm. So what's the result? Quote, it turns kids into spectators of history rather than participants, end quote. And that is from Lindsay Cormack, who wrote a book entitled How to Raise a Citizen. And that's precisely what data shows. More and more students, as they become adults, are spectators rather than participants. In fact, you hear all the time, you know, well, the lowest voting percentage oftentimes is, I say kids, young people in their 20s.
And you're not just saying that. You've got actual study here, stats to back what you're saying.
According to the Harvard Youth Poll, a national survey of 18 to 29-year-olds showed that, quote, most young Americans do not believe that their high school education taught and prepared them to understand practical aspects of voting and civic education, end quote. Fewer than half of those surveyed said their education taught them how to register to vote, research candidates and ballot issues, or request and submit a ballot. In How to Raise a Citizen, Cormack says voting is the democratic door that, quote, allows a person entry into every other part of politics. When people know about a system and how to participate in it, participation goes up. End quote.
Look at football, and you've got your virtual leagues and all this other stuff, and people live and breathe that, and it's so popular. Or March Madness that's going on, and people really get into that.
Right.
We could get that same energy into how our government works and being a participating citizen. I think that would be awesome.
I know I used to ask kids some fact about history or civics. You know, how many of you can name X, Y, or Z? Of course, it'd be none or maybe one or two. And then I'd say, well, how many of you can name all the players on the Pacers or the Colts or the Chicago Bulls? Or, you know, and of course, with guys,
almost every hand goes,
yeah, I know, or baseball. Yeah, they know all that stuff.
That's the enthusiasm we need for being a citizen.
Exactly. So one of the costs that Americans pay for the civic deficit is one of the costs is low voter turnout.
Yes.
And we talked about that in our last couple of episodes. We must insist on more than just a semester or a year of civic education for American children. I will add that some school systems do go above and beyond teaching civics using curriculums like We the People that teaches students at all levels, not just facts, but how to think and how to apply and how to engage principles of our government and civic life. But we need more of this. And I mentioned that one because that's the one I'm most familiar with, but I know there's also the Bill of Rights Institute out there that does a lot of engagement with students and has a lot of teacher resources. The National Constitution Center. The thing is they have something for all levels. It's not just for middle school or just high school. They start out at the elementary level. And that's where we need to be starting is, not just teaching kids how to say the Pledge of Allegiance or the words to the national anthem, but they need to know more and then build on that as they go on to middle school and high school.
And I remember in high school, at Logansport High School, where I grew up, it seems like it was right around April, and we did Good Government Day. And when students actually got to participate and knew the people running for office that day. So there was a mayor for the day and the clerk treasurer for the day. And then they would go to the actual city building and spend time. And everybody got into that. And I think that's a really cool feature that just goes to show that you can get people motivated.
Right. And they still do that here, by the way. But there needs to be more things like that go on that show students, what it's really like and how to do this and go to a meeting and, how the meeting is run, how to get engaged there.
Yeah. And I think they did like a mock city council meeting as part of their day for this Good Government Day. And then they got to see, a lot of times you hear about when the public goes and sits down in the seat to testify in front of the city council and complain or congratulate the city on something. Well, this gives them a whole different point of view when they're the ones that have to make the decision.
And that's one thing I liked about the We the People program when I did it, the middle school and high school. I think elementary may have had something, but we actually, if you did the whole thing in December, you would take your students, if you wanted to Indy, and they would do these they were supposed to be like a mock congressional hearing. You were competing against the other schools, but you weren't in there with them. But you would travel around to different rooms, and they would have like 3 judges, and these would be people that were actually judges or attorneys or other educators in some way knew a lot about government. There were questions, and the students had to be able to sit there on their feet because they didn't know what all the questions were going to be ahead of time. And they had to be able to apply these things that we had learned in class, which were aspects of how our government works. And they had to be able to apply that on their feet and be able to think.
And when you're in the hot seat, those seeds of enthusiasm that you planted as a teacher start to sprout.
Obviously, you wanted to win because there was like they gave awards to the top 3, and then they gave their 6 units. So each unit, school team that got the best score per unit got a little award. So, it's an excellent experience for them.
Yeah, it sounds exciting. I'm getting excited just talking about it. It's being nostalgic for me.
In our local newspaper the other day, the Ferris Tribune, the League of Women Voters here in Cass County published a short editorial piece that showed voting data for Cass County, Indiana, which is where I live. The article demonstrates, quote, this was a quote from it, how a few people are making the decisions for the many, end quote. For example, in the 2020 presidential election, there were 21,832 registered voters in Cass County in 2020. 5,952 ballots were cast. That equates to 27.26% of eligible voters who actually went and cast their ballot.
Right, barely a quarter.
And if you think about it, 21,000 registered voters, we have like 16,000 people just in the city.
Yeah.
So that's one statistic. And then they had in the 2022 midterm elections, there were 22,471 registered voters in Cass County. 3,176 voted. That's 14.13%.
And those numbers are stunning. I mean, you've already pointed out the 27%, but then when you point out only 14% voted in a midterm, and that's what we're in, isn't it? We're in in a midterm year.
And some would say, well, it was just a midterm. Yeah, but every midterm includes your representatives to U.S. Congress.
Right. Every time.
So, and local offices, but you're voting on your person that you're sending for your district
to Washington,
out to Washington to help make decisions.
And 14%. We can do better than that.
Right. And then the final one was they had the statistics for the 2024 presidential election year. We had 22,107 registered voters, only 3,730, that's 16.87% voted. So very sad. Very sad.
Yeah,
numbers.
And you're right. Very few people are deciding the elections.
And we have early voting and, you know, the vote centers. So it's not like you can only go the one day from 6 to 6 and you have to go to a certain place.
Right.
It's so easy.
It's more convenient now than it has really pretty much been ever in our lifetime.
It's hard to make an excuse for why you don't.
Agreed.
One thing I did point out, the League of Women Voters attributed the better turnout in 2020, because that was when there was 27% that showed up, was that was COVID year, and Indiana, anyway, allowed more mail-in voting, or they had like drop boxes for a longer period of time. They didn't have as many restrictions on voting that way that year because of the COVID pandemic. So
it just goes to show that when you make it convenient and you make less hurdles for people, that they will come to the table and they will vote, and that's important.
But, the point is, overall, those numbers are
so
absolutely pathetic. Absolutely pathetic. Are we really willing to let 20% of the registered voters speak for us? Well, I'm not me and not you, but the rest of you that are not out there, and you're not registered to vote, or you're not voting, even if you are registered. Is that really what you want?
Right.
Is to let everybody else make those decisions.
You don't have a seat at the table, really, if you're not voting. And
then I also looked up on my own. The Cass County numbers are worse than the averages for Indiana as a whole. In 2024, for example, 61.5% of registered voters in Indiana cast a ballot. So it is better statewide, but still, 40% of the people are letting everybody else make the decisions.
Indiana's got one of the lowest voter turnouts in all of America.
Not just the lowest voter turnout, but the lower registered number of registered voters too.
Yeah. Sad.
It's not as bad as voter turnout, but it's still, I believe we're in the lower 10 in both of those.
Yeah. Again, we can do better than that.
And we should. There's one aspect. Another problem is teaching American citizens to be able to detect misinformation and doublespeak. It is extremely important to be able to figure out fact from fiction. To abandon facts is to abandon freedom. If nothing is true, then no one can criticize power because there's no basis for which to do so. If nothing is true, then all is spectacle. Remember, you submit to tyranny when you deny the difference between what you want to hear and what is actually true.
The truth is the truth is the truth is the truth.
And we talked about that in our, not last episode, but the two before that, about tyranny.
Yeah, there's sometimes that I learned this lesson at a very young age, that there was sometimes where I hated the truth, but it didn't change.
Sometimes the truth hurts.
It hurts. We learned so many of those sayings. Yeah, but the truth is the truth. There's no spin. It's the truth.
And keep in mind, if it sounds too good to be true, then it's probably not true.
Right.
And if it's just being repeated over and over, that does not make it true either. If a single person claims that they alone can fix the problems, they're lying.
I underlined that when I went through reviewing, because that is such a great point to make. If one person, we've been here 250 years, and if one person is saying, elect me and I'm going to fix everything, that's a red flag.
And that's a misunderstanding. That's somebody that believes that doesn't understand how our government works.
Right.
Because it's not just one person. Also, learn to investigate. But when you're doing that investigation, look for factual information and statistics, not just what someone says. Don't fall for the use of hyperbolic terms. That means exaggerated. Terrorists, they're all terrorists. They're extremists. We hear the left, the extreme leftist, and all. Terms like these are most generally, I would be willing to say, 99% of the time, exaggeration.
It doesn't matter which side is using terminology like that, left or right. It's a red flag for people.
Yes, it most certainly is. Another issue we face is the state of civil discourse in America. We all need to make a better attempt at peaceful civil discourse. If you would like and haven't listened to past episodes, if you go back to our episode 20 from October 9th of last year, 2025, we talked a whole episode about civil discourse. So I'm just going to touch on a couple things here as just a review. We need to follow the 5 value sets that lead to peaceful civil discourse. And those are 1, being caring, compassionate, and kind. 2, honesty, perspective, and talking. Mm-hmm. And by that, I mean your tone. What's your tone?
It matters.
Are you coming across as harsh or,
I have to say that I felt when I read through this, I felt the heat a little bit because I need to work on this for myself.
Well, I think we all do at some point.
Yeah.
And especially if somebody gets our feathers all ruffled.
Absolutely.
That's your general.
It's
you're
defensiveness.
Protecting yeah. Number 3 is humility. Be willing to admit that you're wrong or that you've changed your mind. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that towards the end, something I heard today on a podcast. 4th, integrity. Mm-hmm. And then finally, mutual respect. We've got to get mutual respect in there. Yeah. And that goes not just for all of us regular citizens. Those are things we need to be seeing in our government as well.
Yeah.
Between members of Congress, the president, no matter who it is, it's something we should always see. Take winning off the table when having a discussion.
That's so hard.
It is. It shouldn't be
but it is
us versus them.
Yeah.
We all live in the United States, so the outcome is mutually beneficial to both sides. We shouldn't even think in terms of sides.
Right.
Be willing to listen and change your mind if you hear something that makes sense and it aligns with your values. Stop believing everything you see on Facebook, X, other social media, or from the talking heads on TV opinion shows that try to pass themselves off as news.
Right.
Much of the content is there to mess with you.
And it has.
Yeah. If you want to research an issue, use facts and statistics, not opinion. Back to the being willing to listen and change your mind. I was listening to another podcast, a national podcast earlier, and I'll tell you, it was comedian Tig Notaro. She was on the Nicole Wallace's Best People podcast, and she was telling a story, and I thought that really connects with what we're going to talk about in our podcast. She explained that when she was in school, she ended up actually quitting school, but she wasn't a good student. But she had one teacher along the way who kind of took her under her wing and tried to help her. And at the time she was in school, she said she knew that this particular teacher was very religious and ultra-conservative, and she had even seen and heard this teacher speak out against gay rights and trans rights, and that was several years before. And years later, Tig Notaro noticed that this former teacher, the same one, started following Tig's social media, like Facebooks and Instagram and whatever else she was on. So Tig thought, I'm going to reach out to her, because I don't know if our listeners don't know, Tig Notaro is gay.
Yes.
And she's married to a woman. So she decided to reach out to this former teacher because she thought it was strange that this teacher who formerly was against gay rights and trans was following her, since Tig herself stands up for gay rights all the time. So she contacted this former teacher, and they decided, she asked her if they could get together for lunch. They went out to lunch, and Tig said, I just decided to just come right out and
rip
just
off
ask
the Band-Aid,
her. Yep, just then. In fact, she might have said those exact words. She said, I asked her to her face that she was following her and that she, of course, is gay, but she remembered that that this teacher had, used to post all that stuff. And the former teacher said, I did say all of those things a long time ago, but I've changed. I grew up in a family and an environment where I was taught and thought I believed those things. She said, I'm still religious, but she said she's realized that those beliefs and feelings were not her own. And she took ownership and admitted that she feels differently now, and she's willing to admit it. So I just thought,
that's humility.
It is right there.
Owning your words and being open to living life and learning that maybe learning what you were taught is not necessarily the reality or how you feel. I look at somebody like that and I tip my hat to that person.
It just makes me respect them even more because, I think back to like when we've talked before, I would ask students, because when we would talk about like the political spectrum, where do you fall on this? Oh, well, I'd be a Republican, or I'd, insert Democrat there as well, because my parents are. Or I think this because my parents do.
Right.
And I'm sure that's probably what this former teacher of hers was basically saying. That's what was beat in, not literally, but beat into my head. And
it's like my family drank Pepsi, so I drank Pepsi. My family drank Coke, so I drank, or we drove Chevys, or we drove Fords, right?
Right. Exactly. So, anybody that can change their mind and opinion and even admit that, I just respect them to, that's the way it should be.
It is. That's a sign of an intelligent person, and it shows growth. Right. And it shows, humility is the perfect word. And I think this all ties back into what you were saying about take social media out of it, because social media, let's just be honest, it is a huge problem when it comes to these things. People say stuff on social media that they would never sit and say to your face. Right. The power of a face-to-face conversation and hearing what one side says and allowing the other side to respond, I think that's so powerful.
If you're on computer or your phone or whatever, you can't hear the tone of the person's voice or see their facial expressions. How much we get out of just looking at the person as we're talking to them. It's, and if a politician is willing to change their mind, that's even better. That's even better, right? Maybe it was both Obama and Biden who changed their minds about gay marriage, for example, and admitted it when they first, at first they were against it. Yeah. And
I like that. I don't want to send somebody to Washington that has their mind made up on every single thing, because that tells me they're not listening to their constituents, that there's a brick wall there. So I feel like I've been to church, Bobbi. I'm going to call you Reverend Fisher. I needed to hear that. I hope other folks did.
I just thought it was a great story, and it just kind of went right into what we're talking about there. So
yeah, no, it was a great way to underscore that. As Ross on Friends would say, let's pivot. And let's jump into our history lesson.
Don't know much about history.
So this is our Don't Know Much About History. You carry him in your pocket or purse every day, but how much do you really know about the man whose face is on the quarter and the dollar bill? Born to a tobacco planter on February 22nd, 1732, he is one of the most fascinating yet contradictory characters in American history. If cutting down cherry trees and wooden teeth are all you think you know about this man, stay tuned. When he was 11, his father died, and he inherited a small farm and 10 slaves. He soon went to live with his uncle Lawrence at Mount Vernon Plantation, and he had only a distant relationship with his mother. He had very little formal education and did not attend college. The story of him chopping down a cherry tree was actually made up after his death by biographer Mason Weems. He also never had wooden teeth, but had several sets of false teeth made of cow, teeth, human teeth, and even ivory. I am, of course, talking about the man who led the American victory in the Revolutionary War and our first president, George Washington.
I won't say, all right, father, I cannot tell a lie, but I will say, all right, teacher, I will admit, I will admit, I definitely heard the wooden teeth thing.
But here's the thing, and I never really thought much about it until we were at Mount Vernon on one of my Washington, D.C. trips with 8th graders. One of the kids, I think, said something because they have like a set or two of his teeth in like a circular glass case thing. And they said, I thought he had wooden teeth. And the docent that was there overheard that and said, now think about it. If you had wood in your mouth where your mouth is moist all the time, what would happen to that wood besides rotting? Splinters?
Yes. I don't know, but not that the thought of having a cow tooth in my mouth, though. But you know what? That was the innovation at the time.
Right.
That was probably really innovative at the time.
Right.
And the cherry tree thing, chopping down the cherry tree. I mean, so a lot of what I remember about Washington from school is not even true.
Right. We think it's not. But
that was a fun one. Thank you for that one. Okay, so I can hear the bell. So, Bobbi, it's time to get back to work and back to the topic we were talking about.
So I'm going to give you some food for thought in the last part of this episode. Let's think about some of the things I mentioned in the first part, but kind of in reverse. I'm going to ask a lot of questions. They're rhetorical questions, but I'll give you some information after. So what happens if we continue to decrease the quality and amount of civics education our schools offer? Who benefits from the ignorance of our citizens? If citizens don't understand how our government is supposed to work, then they won't realize why their ignorance makes it easier for those elected to government positions to pass laws and allow actions that go against the Constitution and their interests. Remember, it is the citizens who are supposed to be sovereign or the highest authorities in our republic. Remember, it is we the people. But if the people are kept ignorant and uninformed, they will not realize that our leaders are taking actions that diminish their authority and their rights.
Yeah, and who benefits from the people staying ignorant? That's a scary thought, especially if you think about some other countries where elections are held, but they really don't even mean anything.
And in reverse, I think back to what we started with. The whole point of public education was to teach kids to be good citizens, to understand the government so that we could continue this now almost 250-year experiment in self-governance. That's another way to look at it. If we make people more ignorant of all this or keep them ignorant, who's going to carry on government? That's self-government.
We need to get that 50 cents back up to at least $5.
Yeah, at least.
Yeah, at least.
Personally, it should be 100.
Yeah.
Leave STEM at 50.
Yes.
What happens if fewer and fewer eligible voters exercise their right to vote? It is possible that the people in power will see elections as unnecessary, since almost half of eligible voters don't even exercise their right to vote. They must not value it or need it, right? Maybe the leaders in the future won't try to limit the vote, but maybe they will take it away completely or make it so it doesn't really affect the outcomes of elections like it is in Russia or North Korea and other places where they have an election, but it's already a foregone conclusion.
Is it legitimate?
Yeah. As to who's going to be the winner. What happens if the government takes control of all of the news and media companies? What if we only get to hear what a certain group of leaders want us to hear? What if they try to keep from us what is really going on? We are getting a bit of a taste of that right now with the war in Iran. Even members of Congress who are entitled to this information are being kept in the dark. When we can't receive unbiased, factual news and information, it's like being put in a dark room with no windows and light and expected to find your way out. When the government keeps us in the dark and takes actions that we have no direct or indirect input in, and by indirect I mean through our elected representatives, we pay the price by having to see our sons and daughters fight in an unjustified war on another continent that didn't have to happen. Or we see our tax dollars going to projects a majority of Americans disapprove of, instead of seeing those tax dollars fund programs that help people.
The fact that we've shed so many reporters from the Pentagon at a time when we need people in that room asking the hard questions, this is not the time to have fewer people in the room asking questions.
Well, and I think back to what I said there, they had the the meeting with members of Congress last week, the administration did, and many of them, even on the
they were
right,
stunned.
they left totally ticked off because they didn't get their questions answered. And it wasn't just Democrats, it was Republicans as well. And, even some of them that I saw interviewed from the Republican side were like, we aren't sure they know what they're doing. And, and we still don't understand what's going on. So that's scary.
Yeah, you're right. This is another time where social media comes in and misinformation gets in there and gums up the system. And when we're talking about spending lives, American lives, or lives in general, and spending lots of tax dollars, I think there needs to be a clear narrative of what is happening and why it's happening, in so much as it doesn't compromise our military plans. But I still think there needs to be clear communication. And I think if we had clear communication, it would make it easier for people to really get behind the war and support it, or say, hey, no, this is wrong. But right now, I feel like we're sort of in a gray area, and that we need more information provided, especially when we're being asked to send in $200 billion additional.
What happens if our civil discourse continues to disintegrate into further nastiness? In a similar example, what if our members of Congress continue to not carry out civil debate and discussion of issues that affect us, and each side just keeps holding out to get everything their side wants without being willing to compromise? Who benefits from this stubbornness? Is this what the founders wanted in people elected to Congress? What if the framers had been this way during the Constitutional Convention in 1787? Would we be celebrating the 250th birthday of our great nation this summer? Of course, the answer to all of that is no. Members of Congress need to remember that we, the people, elect them to represent us. They are supposed to be there serving us, providing for the common good and general welfare, and protecting us from all enemies, foreign or domestic. This takes people willing to compromise and actually work to achieve the common good. They need to listen to their constituents and should not be taking their instructions from the president, not him alone. We must continue to call our members of Congress and voice our preferences and concerns, and if those elected representatives continue to ignore us, then we vote them out. We must continue to participate in rallies and protests, as this shows our strength as we the people. It shows our elected leaders how we feel about issues in our country. It reinforces those calls, emails, and letters that we send to them voicing our concerns. It is also a right protected by the First Amendment. We must continue to insist on more funding for civics education for our children and future voters. We must demand this, as it is just as important, if not more important, than STEM education. Everyone is a citizen, but not everyone will be a scientist, mathematician, computer whiz, or engineer. Not that those aren't important vocations. That's not what I'm saying. We must have all of them, but even people in those vocations are citizens first. Civics education must be practical and not just memorization of facts. Students need to learn how to carry on a civil conversation, debate, think, and problem solve, and understand how public policy is created and how it affects us. Teachers must be able to teach these skills without fear of retaliation. We must continue to encourage our friends and neighbors to register to vote and actually participate in voting, including knowing how to decide which candidates to vote for based on their personal values. Finally, we must continue to push back on government control of our news and entertainment networks, and we must not accept the silencing of comedians and entertainers, or any citizen for that matter, whose speech is protected by the First Amendment.
So there's the bell. That means it's time for our pop quiz. Bueller.
Last episode's question was name 2 cabinet-level positions. And as we said then, there are a ton of them. There's like 15. So I'll just go down the list. I'm going to start with Attorney General and Vice President, because they technically are considered part of the cabinet. And the rest of these I'll start with Secretary of, and I'm not going to say that. So we have Commerce, Agriculture, Defense, or what they're wanting to call war, but it hasn't officially been changed. Education, Energy, Health and Human Services, Homeland Security, Housing and Urban Development, Interior, labor, state, transportation, treasury, and Veterans Affairs.
I think I could have gotten a lot of those, but I guarantee you I would not have remembered every single one.
I don't think I could either, but I could probably come pretty close.
All right, so what do we have for a question next time?
Okay, so this episode's question, also from the U.S. Naturalization Test, what does the judicial branch do? So now there's 4 different points I've got noted here, that ways you can answer this, which actually they have all of these. They're all different responsibilities. So if you can come up with even one of their duties, that would be great.
I feel like you're going to be a little lenient with your grading on the answers to this. We have 4 areas that can be the answers for this week's quiz. So thank you for all of that, Bobbi. I also want to bring up our Facebook page, Plain Civics. It's that easy. Just go to Facebook and type in Plain Civics, and you will find so much information there. In fact, you've done a great job of posting a lot of things we've talked about in the last few episodes on there. If you weren't Indiana-based, you've put some different links on there where folks can find some different answers. So if you haven't liked us on Facebook on Plain Civics, be sure to do that. We would certainly appreciate it. Plus, we like to hear from you. And if you want to reach out to us and don't want to do it on the Facebook page, you can send us an email. And our email address is plaincivicspodcast, no caps or spaces or anything, @gmail.com. plaincivicspodcast@gmail.com. And we did get some feedback.
I'm not sure if this person is a male or female, but is a positive thanking us for the work that we're doing. They actually are from somewhere in Florida. They like our podcast and have promoted it with other friends and maybe family. They did have a concern, and I want to just briefly touch on that. Their concern is that they think since January that we maybe are getting a little bit off of our nonpartisan. And I just want to say that if you've listened to all of our podcasts, we've talked about that in the podcast itself several times. We even considered taking out a part of a couple of them and discussed it and decided that what we were saying is factual. So in that way, needed to stay in. If people saw that as being partisan, we've talked about this, no matter who the president is, if they or their administration were doing some of the things that we're seeing, I'd be willing to call them out. I don't care if they're a Democrat or a Republican. The whole point of pointing out some of those things, even though they may have sounded partisan, is that they go against our Constitution, that our government is supposed to be run, or what people's duties are. It'd be different if we were just saying, oh, we don't like them, and it's like, that's not the point. The point is calling out what they're doing because they aren't following the Constitution.
It's not the norm. Right? There's a lot of things happening that are not the norm. And I completely understand the point of the person who wrote in. I want people to feel like they can write in and agree or disagree with us because, again, we're trying to have a conversation here and we want all sides to be represented. In the current state of things, there's a lot of norm busting that's going on. And so, therefore, that spills over into this conversation. And that's where we dip into your expertise of being a civics teacher, and you can say, this is the way it's been, or this Supreme Court decision changed this or that. And I appreciate them writing in. Thank you for doing that. And I'll just underscore what you say. We do, when we do these episodes, whether it makes the final cut or not, we have offline discussions because we are sensitive to trying to toe that line. And that is why I value this podcast so much, is I want us to be driving down the center lane.
Hopefully, if people are willing to look certain things up themselves and they see that, well, wow, they're right. They're not supposed to be doing that. And they can contact their representative or their senator. And this gives them the educational background they need to know that this isn't the way this should be happening. And our podcast just started last year. So unfortunately, we don't have experience, having a different administration in. But I would like to think that we would be doing the same thing, whether it was a Democrat or a Republican. That doesn't matter to me. What matters is that they're following the Constitution and doing things the way they should be doing things, and that they're not harming our government and our democracy and sending our kids off to war. And
I think a good example, we just ran down the cabinet level positions, and you mentioned Secretary of Defense, and right now the administration is referring to it as Secretary of War. And that's his prerogative. However, you know, as a civics teacher, and you taught me this because I didn't know it until you pointed it out, but it's technically still the Secretary of Defense until it's changed in Congress.
And I think I mentioned this on one of our very early episodes. When cabinet was first created under Washington's administration, there was an Attorney General, Secretary of Treasury, State, and War. So they initially called it the Department of War. As time went on, people decided that had a negative connotation to it. And that's why it was changed to defense. And so, first of all, Congress has the authority to change it. They haven't done that. Technically, you know, an executive order is only as good as the law it stands on. And so this one, it's kind of like the Gulf of Mexico. We don't have the authority to change that. That's international waters. Like, you know, anyway, I appreciate that. I don't want to discourage people from writing, you know, and I appreciate this person's kudos to all the work we're putting into this. I just want them to know that we do discuss the content, and we have had those discussions a couple of times and just decided that it's factual information. It's necessary to further the education that we're trying to give to people.
And we've also made comments before in recording and looked at each other, and we've made the executive decision of that we have to cut that out because that crosses a line. So we've edited out stuff both ways. We've kept stuff both ways. All right. So thank you, Florida, for writing in. We appreciate that. And before I let you go, Bobbi, when you were reading from your podcast with Tig, your notes earlier today, can you just hold up that piece of paper so I can see it? Is that actually like ripped out of a spiral notebook? I love that.
I was in the car sitting at Burger King, and I had to keep rewinding like 15, 30 seconds because I was trying to not miss, you know, her points that she was making.
As you were reading it, it just made my soul happy to see that you actually ripped it out of a spiral notebook. That brought back good school memories. All right, Bobbi, thank you for putting all the hard work into this, the research that you do every time we do an episode. I appreciate your expertise and for you putting pen to paper and doing this for us so we have something to talk about each episode. So thank you.
You're welcome.
And that's it for this episode of Plain Civics, breaking down the basics, no politics, just facts. Thanks for listening, and until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.
This is Plain Civics. Join us for the journey as we break down the basics of how government works, so you can make the government work for you.